Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We are interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the rolling hills of McDowell County, West Virginia, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, there once stood a residence that locals came to call the Wayside. The two-story farmhouse, built of weathered oak and pine with a wide front porch overlooking a narrow dirt road, sat at the junction of two seldom-traveled paths. The nearest town, Welch, was some 15 miles southeast, and travelers who found themselves lost or caught in the mountain's unpredictable weather patterns considered the illuminated windows of the Wayside a welcome sight indeed. According to county records dated May 1872, the Wayside property was purchased by Edmund and Martha Blackwood, who had relocated from Richmond, Virginia, following the economic devastation of the Civil War. Edmund, formerly a moderately successful merchant, had lost his business during the conflict. The couple arrived in McDowell County with what neighbors described as surprising resources for people who claimed financial hardship. They quickly established their homestead and began operating what they informally called a traveler's rest for those journeying through the mountains. The Blackwoods were, by all accounts, exceptionally gracious hosts. Martha was known for her elaborate meals, and Edmund kept a well-stocked selection of spirits. Their hospitality became something of local legend, with residents of nearby communities often directing weary travelers toward the Wayside. "You'll find no better welcome in all of West Virginia," was a phrase reportedly used by stagecoach drivers and merchants alike. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not the horrific nature of what occurred, but rather the methodical patience with which the Blackwoods operated. Their activities would have likely remained undiscovered had it not been for an unusually severe winter in 1889 that forced a county tax assessor to seek shelter at their property for 3 consecutive nights, longer than any guest had been known to stay. In the spring of 1876, a prominent feature was added to the Blackwood property, a root cellar dug deep into the hillside behind the main house. Edmund explained to neighbors that the cellar's unusual depth, reportedly extending some 30 feet into the mountainside, was necessary for storing provisions through the harsh mountain winters. Local men helped with the initial excavation, but Edmund insisted on completing the interior work himself, citing his desire for specific storage arrangements that only he understood. The construction of this cellar coincided with a particularly prosperous period for the Blackwoods. Edmund had begun traveling to larger towns along the railway lines, returning with furniture, fabrics, and other goods that seemed beyond the means of a simple innkeeper. When questioned by the occasional curious neighbor, he would explain that he had maintained business connections from his merchant days, allowing him to procure items at favorable prices. This explanation, delivered with Edmund's characteristic blend of modesty and confidence, was generally accepted without further inquiry. Martha, meanwhile, transformed the Wayside into a notable establishment through her domestic talents. Her meals were spoken of throughout the county, featuring dishes uncommon to the region's typical fare. She cultivated an extensive herb garden, which she claimed was the secret to her distinctive cooking. Later investigation would reveal that this garden contained several varieties of plants with sedative properties, including a strain of Datura stramonium, commonly known as Jimson weed, whose seeds and leaves can induce disorientation and unconsciousness when properly prepared. By 1880, the Wayside had developed a curious reputation. While travelers who planned to stay were warmly welcomed, locals who visited briefly reported an unsettling atmosphere. Sarah Conley, wife of a nearby farmer, noted in a personal letter to her sister in Maryland, "When calling upon Martha with preserves, I cannot shake the feeling that I've interrupted something significant. The house falls silent just before my arrival, as if conversations cease at the sound of approaching footsteps. Martha accepts my gifts with genuine warmth, yet there's something in Edmund's eyes, a calculation that makes me depart sooner than courtesy would typically allow. This subtle unease never consolidated into explicit suspicion. The Blackwoods were regular attendees at the Methodist Church in Welch, making the 15-mile journey every Sunday regardless of weather. Edmund served on informal community councils, offering measured opinions on matters from road maintenance to dispute resolution. Their integration into local society was so complete that when occasional rumors arose regarding strange sounds heard by those passing the wayside at night, they were quickly dismissed as mountain wind or the natural settling of a wooden structure. The Blackwoods maintained detailed guest ledgers, a practice Edmund attributed to his former merchant habits. These ledgers, recovered during later investigations, showed a steady stream of visitors between 1872 and 1889. Curiously, while the ledgers meticulously recorded arrivals, they contained no mention of departures. When questioned about this during their first informal inquiry, Edmund simply stated that he had no interest in when people left, only in properly preparing for their arrival. A careful analysis of these ledgers, conducted after the Blackwoods' arrest, revealed a sophisticated coding system embedded within seemingly routine notations. Particular ink colors, subtle variations in handwriting, and certain marginalia appeared to indicate which guests had been selected for what the Blackwoods reportedly called extended hospitality. This system ensured that they could track their activities without creating explicitly incriminating records. In the autumn of 1881, Jeremiah Fulton, a horse trader from Kentucky, was reported missing by business associates after failing to arrive in Charleston for a scheduled meeting. Fulton's planned route would have taken him within miles of the wayside, and investigators from the Pinkerton Detective Agency made inquiries at several establishments along his expected path. The Blackwoods confirmed his stay on September 18th, stating that Fulton had enjoyed their hospitality for a single night before continuing his journey southward the following morning. With no evidence to suggest otherwise, investigators pursued other leads. Fulton's disappearance would later be connected to a curious transaction recorded in the ledger of a wheeling bank. 3 weeks after he was last seen, a draft drawn on his account was processed, transferring a substantial sum to a merchant account in Pittsburgh. The signature, while similar to Fulton's, contained subtle discrepancies that became apparent only when directly compared with verified examples. The Blackwoods' connection to this transaction was established through travel records showing Edmund's presence in Wheeling on the precise date the draft was presented. Similar inquiries occurred in 1883, 1885, and twice in 1887, each involving travelers who had vanished somewhere in the vicinity of McDowell County. In each instance, the Blackwoods provided consistent, unremarkable testimonies. Yes, the individuals had stayed at the wayside. No, nothing unusual had occurred. Yes, they had departed in good health, continuing their intended journeys. The disappearances were attributed to the dangers inherent in mountain travel, accidents, exposure, or the occasional bandit still operating in remote regions following the war. What distinguished the Blackwoods from other malevolent figures of the era was their remarkable restraint. Unlike many perpetrators of heinous acts, they did not target every visitor who crossed their threshold. Tax records and business correspondence suggest that for every person who vanished after visiting the wayside, 5 or 6 departed without incident. This selective approach not only prevented patterns from forming too obviously, but also ensured a steady stream of positive accounts about the Blackwoods' hospitality circulated throughout the region. Their selection process, as far as can be determined from recovered documents and testimony, focused on several key criteria: travelers carrying significant valuables or financial instruments, those unlikely to be immediately missed, and individuals without traveling companions. They showed particular interest in merchants, bankers, and others with access to financial systems that could be manipulated through forged documents. A disturbing element of their methodology emerged through Martha's personal diary, discovered concealed within the lining of a trunk in their bedroom. She described an elaborate evaluation process during the evening meal, where conversation was deliberately steered toward topics that would reveal a guest's financial status, family connections, and expected arrival at their next destination. The diary entries suggest that final selections were often made during these conversations, with Martha and Edmund exchanging predetermined signals to confirm their decision. One entry, dated August 1884, reads, "Tonight's visitor possesses both the means and the isolation we require. His conversation revealed substantial holdings in Cleveland, yet his business associates expect communication only upon reaching Cincinnati some 2 weeks hence. Edmund gave the napkin signal, and I have prepared the special tea. By morning, our guest will have relocated to the lower rooms, where Edmund can begin the necessary conversations." The winter of 1888-1889 brought record snowfall to the Appalachian region. Roads became impassable for weeks at a time, and communities found themselves isolated beyond the norm. It was during this period of exceptional seclusion that Thomas Hargrove, a county tax assessor, newly appointed to the McDowell district, found himself stranded at the wayside during a routine collection visit. Hargrove's personal journal, later recovered from his residence in Welch, provides the first contemporaneous account of extended stay at the Blackwood property. His initial entries echo the common sentiment about the exceptional hospitality he received. By the third day, however, his observations take a more analytical tone. "I have now been at the wayside for 3 nights, and certain peculiarities in the household routine have become apparent. The Blackwoods retire to the root cellar each evening for approximately 1 hour before supper preparations begin. When they emerge, Martha appears flushed, and Edmund's demeanor shifts from cordial to effusive. I initially attributed this to the sampling of their stored spirits, but their movements possess a precision that contradicts inebriation." On his 4th day of confinement due to weather, Hargrove noted that he had been assigned a different bedroom, one adjacent to the staircase rather than his previous room at the end of the hall. "The explanation offered was that the chimney better heats this room," he wrote, "yet I observed ice formations on the interior window glass, suggesting poorer insulation than my previous accommodation. More curious is the new locking mechanism on my door, installed on the outside rather than within." Hargrove's account describes increasingly strange behaviors as his stay extended into a second week. He noted that Martha would often stand motionless at windows for extended periods, staring into the snow-covered landscape without apparent purpose. Edmund's conversation became progressively dominated by philosophical discussions about natural law and what he called the morality of survival. Most concerning were the voices Hargrove occasionally heard late at night, muffled conversations that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards, though the Blackwoods insisted they were the only occupants of the property. Hargrove's penultimate entry describes sounds that awakened him in the night. "The hour was perhaps 2 a.m. when I was roused by what I initially took to be the wind. Listening more carefully, I discerned a rhythmic scratching emanating not from outside the house, but from within the wall adjacent to my bed. The sound continued for approximately 20 minutes before ceasing abruptly. I confess that sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night." The final entry in Hargrove's journal, dated February 17, 1889, consists of a single line: "I have found a loose floorboard beneath the bureau. What lies beneath cannot be accidental." This entry was written in a noticeably hurried hand compared to his previous methodical script. Later testimony would reveal what Hargrove had discovered. The loose floorboard concealed a small opening through which voices from the cellar below could be heard more clearly. It is believed that Hargrove, upon making this discovery, attempted to investigate further by removing additional boards. This activity likely alerted the Blackwoods to his suspicions, precipitating his removal to the cellar chambers that same night. When spring thaws finally permitted travel into the more remote regions of McDowell County, Hargrove's supervisor dispatched a colleague, William Abernathy, to complete the tax collections that had been interrupted by the severe weather. Abernathy arrived at the wayside on April 3, 1889. The Blackwoods informed him that Hargrove had departed weeks earlier, once the snow had partially receded, mentioning his intention to make collections in the southern portion of the county before returning to Welch. Abernathy found this account plausible, but was troubled by one detail. Hargrove had left behind his official county ledger, which no tax assessor would willingly abandon. When Abernathy inquired about this discrepancy, Edmund Blackwood explained that Hargrove had been maintaining duplicate records and had taken his personal copy, intending to transcribe the information upon his return to the county offices. The explanation was delivered with such confident reasonableness that Abernathy's suspicions were momentarily allayed. What Abernathy could not have known was that during his brief visit to the wayside, Hargrove was imprisoned barely 30 feet from where they conversed. Court records indicate that Hargrove later recalled hearing Abernathy's voice, a moment of desperate hope followed by profound despair as his colleague departed without discovering his presence. Upon his return to Welch, however, Abernathy discovered that Hargrove had never arrived. More concerning, collections in the southern districts had not been attempted. A preliminary search was organized, operating on the theory that Hargrove had met with misfortune on the mountain paths between the wayside and town. Nothing was discovered, and as spring advanced into summer, the matter might have been relegated to the growing list of unfortunate disappearances in the region had it not been for the arrival of a Pinkerton detective named James Sullivan. Sullivan had been engaged by the family of Albert Reynolds, a timber merchant from Pennsylvania who had vanished the previous autumn. Reynolds's last known location, according to correspondence with his business partners, was an overnight stay at a hospitable residence at the junction of Thorn Creek and the old military road, a description that clearly identified the wayside. Sullivan's investigation had been delayed by winter weather, but by June 1889 he had established himself in Welch and begun methodically reconstructing Reynolds' final known movements. Sullivan's approach differed from previous investigators. Rather than directly questioning the Blackwoods, he spent weeks gathering information from surrounding communities, creating a comprehensive record of travelers who had passed through the region over the previous 5 years. Through this patient compilation, a troubling pattern gradually emerged. A disproportionate number of disappearances involved individuals whose last known location was the wayside. More tellingly, these disappearances often involved travelers carrying substantial sums or valuable goods, and almost exclusively affected those without companions. Sullivan's investigation also uncovered financial anomalies connected to several missing persons. Bank records in multiple states showed unusual transactions occurring weeks or months after individuals had disappeared, drafts drawn, accounts closed, properties transferred. In each case, the documentation appeared legitimate on initial inspection, but detailed analysis revealed inconsistencies in signatures and procedural irregularities that suggested forgery. The detective's notes, preserved in Pinkerton Agency archives, document his growing certainty regarding the Blackwoods' involvement in these disappearances. The pattern is undeniable, though constructed with exceptional care to avoid detection. What we observe is not opportunistic criminality, but a systematic enterprise operating with industrial precision. My assessment is that E&M Blackwood have refined their methodology through years of practice, suggesting that confirmed disappearances likely represent only a fraction of their actual activities. Armed with this circumstantial but compelling evidence, Sullivan enlisted the assistance of the county sheriff and 4 deputies to conduct a thorough search of the Blackwood property. The initial inspection of the house revealed nothing unusual beyond the curious arrangement of guest room door locks. It was only when attention turned to the root cellar that the true nature of the wayside was revealed. The entrance to the cellar appeared conventional, a heavy wooden door set at an angle in the hillside behind the main house. Inside, roughly hewn steps descended into darkness. The main chamber contained what one would expect: shelves, lined with preserved foods, barrels of apples, potatoes stored in straw, and several casks of whiskey. At the back of this chamber, partially concealed behind a large storage rack, investigators discovered a second door, this one reinforced with iron bands and secured with 3 separate locks. According to the sheriff's report, Edmund Blackwood initially claimed the secured area contained valuable family heirlooms and private papers. When pressed to open it, he stated that the keys had been lost years earlier. Sullivan noted that Blackwood's demeanor shifted dramatically during this exchange, from indignant confidence to visible anxiety. A pry bar was ultimately used to force the door. What lay beyond can only be described as methodically arranged horror. The reinforced door opened onto a narrow corridor that extended approximately 20 feet into the hillside. This corridor was lined with 6 small chambers, 3 on each side, each secured with a heavy door featuring a small barred observation window. 5 of the chambers were empty save for a straw pallet and crude sanitation facilities. The 6th contained the emaciated but still living form of Thomas Hargrove. The sheriff's official report describes the corridor in clinical detail. The passageway measures approximately 6 feet in height and 3 feet in width, constructed with timber supports at regular intervals. The walls have been reinforced with a mixture of clay and lime, creating a surface that absorbs sound. Each cell measures approximately 8 feet by 6 feet, with ceiling height of 5 1/2 feet, requiring adult occupants to maintain a stooped posture. Ventilation is provided by narrow shafts extending upward at an angle, emerging at ground level as what would appear to be natural fissures in the rocky hillside. The engineering suggests considerable knowledge of construction principles. Hargrove's physical condition was dire. He had lost considerable weight, and exposure to the cellar's constant dampness had resulted in respiratory infection. More disturbing than his physical state was his psychological deterioration. When discovered, he was reportedly engaged in conversation with individuals who were not present, and he seemed unable to comprehend that his rescue was real rather than imagined. He was immediately transported to Welch for medical attention, but never fully recovered his mental faculties. His fragmented statements during moments of lucidity, however, provided horrifying insights into the Blackwoods' operations. According to Hargrove's testimony, preserved in court records, guests selected for imprisonment were drugged during evening meals. The substance, likely laudanum or a similar opiate tincture, was administered in precise doses to render victims unconscious without risk of death. While incapacitated, they were transported to the cellar chambers. Upon awakening, they would find themselves imprisoned in complete darkness, their only human contact being the Blackwoods' daily delivery of minimal sustenance. What followed was a calculated process of psychological breakdown. Martha would speak kindly through the cell door, explaining that the guest's confinement was temporary, merely a precaution until certain arrangements could be made for their safe passage. Edmund, by contrast, would visit at irregular hours, sometimes speaking reasonably about imminent release, other times delivering prolonged, rambling monologues about divine judgment and necessary sacrifices. This psychological manipulation continued until the victim revealed the location of their valuables or provided information necessary to access their finances, bank drafts that could be forged, business associates who could be contacted under false pretenses, or locations of additional resources. Once the Blackwoods had extracted all possible value, the pattern apparently shifted to one of neglect. Meals became increasingly sporadic until, eventually, they ceased entirely. Edmund would use me as an object lesson, pointing out how my condition had deteriorated as a consequence of what he called resistance to natural law. They employed the suffering of each prisoner as a tool to break the will of others, creating a self-perpetuating system of despair. The final chamber in the underground corridor led to a natural fissure in the limestone substrate, a narrow, vertical shaft that, according to geological surveys conducted during the investigation, connected to a series of natural caves approximately 60 feet below the cellar level. Hargrove's testimony included a particularly disturbing aspect of this process. They would bring new captives past my cell, individuals still in the early stages of their confinement, still believing in the possibility of release. It was into this shaft that the Blackwoods disposed of their victims once they no longer served any purpose. Sullivan's report suggests that the bodies would have been carried by underground water currents into the extensive cave system beneath that region of the Appalachians, effectively eliminating any evidence. An attempt to explore this cave system was made during the investigation, though the technical limitations of the era prevented comprehensive examination. Cave specialists brought from Kentucky managed to descend approximately 40 feet into the shaft before dangerous conditions forced their withdrawal. Their limited observations confirmed that the shaft widened into a substantial cavern with evidence of water flow. They reported hearing what one specialist described as a continuous, distant rushing sound, suggesting connection to a significant subterranean watercourse. The geological particulars of the region supported the Blackwoods disposal method. The Appalachian Mountains contain extensive limestone formations riddled with caves, underground rivers, and sinkholes. Many of these waterways remain unmapped even today. The specific system beneath the wayside was likely connected to the Tug Fork watershed, potentially carrying remains dozens of miles before depositing them in locations that would never be connected to the Blackwoods' activities. When confronted with the physical evidence and Hargrove's testimony, Martha Blackwood reportedly collapsed into uncontrollable laughter, a response so incongruous that several witnesses mentioned it specifically in their statements. Edmund maintained a stoic silence, broken only once to remark, "The mountains have always sustained us, as they should all who understand their gifts." The arrest of the Blackwoods created a sensation throughout the region. The Welch Daily News published a special edition dedicated entirely to the case, featuring a detailed diagram of the underground chambers that was reproduced in newspapers as far away as New York and Chicago. Public fascination with the case was intensified by the contrast between the Blackwoods' respectable appearance and the methodical cruelty of their activities. During their incarceration awaiting trial, Edmund and Martha were held in separate cells at the McDowell County Jail. Guards reported that they showed no interest in communicating with each other, suggesting that their partnership had been based on pragmatic cooperation rather than emotional connection. Martha spent her days writing in a journal that was confiscated weekly and added to the evidence. These writings revealed a mind entirely unburdened by conventional morality, viewing human life through a lens of pure utility. One particularly chilling passage read, "Society's error is in presuming inherent value in human existence. The natural world recognizes no such principle. It acknowledges only what each organism can extract from its environment and competitors. Edmund and I have simply aligned our behavior with fundamental natural law, removing the artificial constraint of supposed human exceptionalism. Those who entered our house were no different from the deer that wanders into a wolf's territory." The legal proceedings that followed were remarkably brief by modern standards. The Blackwoods were charged with the kidnapping and presumed murder of at least 17 individuals, based on correlations between their guest ledger and reported disappearances. Both were found guilty in September 1889 and sentenced to death by hanging, an unusual sentence for Martha, as female defendants were typically spared capital punishment during this era. The judge's unusual decision was explained in his remarks. The methodical nature of these crimes and the evidence of equal participation by both defendants leaves no room for the mercy typically extended to the fairer sex. The trial transcript reveals that neither Blackwood presented a substantive defense. Their court-appointed attorney made procedural objections and attempted to introduce questions about their mental competence, but these efforts gained no traction in the face of overwhelming evidence and the defendant's apparent disinterest in avoiding conviction. Edmund is recorded as having interrupted his own attorney's statements on several occasions, once stating, "There is no point in these theatrical performances. What we have done requires no defense in the court of natural law, and no defense is possible in the court of human fabrication. The execution was carried out on November 12, 1889. According to newspaper accounts, neither Blackwood spoke during their final moments, though observers noted that they exchanged a long glance before the hoods were placed over their heads. The reporter from the Welch Daily News described this exchange as communicating some private understanding that mercifully remains known only to them. In the aftermath, investigators attempted to locate the remains of the Blackwood's victims. Professional cave explorers were brought from as far as Kentucky to navigate the extensive underground system beneath the property. These efforts proved largely unsuccessful due to the dangerous conditions and the likelihood that any remains had been scattered throughout miles of subterranean waterways. A memorial stone was ultimately placed on the hillside above the cellar, bearing no names but simply the inscription, "For those who found no exit from these mountains." The wayside itself was not immediately destroyed, as authorities continued to search the property for additional evidence and possibly overlooked victims. By the spring of 1890, the investigation had concluded, and ownership of the property reverted to McDowell County. Rather than sell the infamous location, county commissioners ordered the structures burned and the cellar entrances sealed with dynamite collapsed debris and concrete. One curious historical footnote concerns the disposal of the Blackwoods' possessions. A public auction was held in Welch, with proceeds designated for the families of identified victims. Attendance was substantial, driven by macabre curiosity, but actual bidding was minimal. Most items went unsold, with locals apparently reluctant to introduce objects from the wayside into their homes. Those few pieces that did sell, primarily utilitarian items like tools and kitchenware, were reported to have been destroyed or discarded by their purchasers after newspapers published accounts of the Blackwoods' methodical poisoning techniques. For several decades, the location was avoided by local residents, though it occasionally attracted morbid tourists and curiosity seekers. By the early 20th century, as the direct memory of the events faded, the precise location became less certain. The county records office suffered a fire in 1923 that destroyed many of the original documents related to the case, further obscuring the exact positioning of the property boundaries. What makes the case of Edmund and Martha Blackwood particularly disturbing from a historical perspective is not merely the number of their victims, but the calculated patience with which they operated. Unlike many criminal figures of the era who were driven by immediate impulses or desperate circumstances, the Blackwoods created a sustainable system that might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the exceptional circumstances that kept Thomas Hargrove on the property beyond the typical single night. The Blackwoods' background remains partially obscured despite extensive investigation following their arrest. Records indicate that Edmund had indeed operated a mercantile business in Richmond before the Civil War, but the establishment was significantly less substantial than he later claimed. Martha's history proved more difficult to trace. Her marriage certificate identified her as Martha Ellen Collins, daughter of a Philadelphia physician, but inquiries in that city failed to locate any family matching this description. This suggests the possibility that both Blackwoods had constructed false identities, perhaps specifically for their relocation to the isolated mountain community. A psychological assessment conducted during the trial by Dr. Henry Whitman of the Western State Lunatic Asylum, now known as Western State Hospital, in Staunton, Virginia, concluded that the Blackwoods suffered from no recognizable mental defect that would explain their actions. His report states they appear to operate from a place of complete rationality, having simply arrived at moral conclusions that diverge catastrophically from societal norms. Most disturbing is their apparent conviction that their actions were not only justified, but somehow ordained by natural law. Dr. Whitman's assessment includes observations about the Blackwoods' unusual emotional responses during interviews. Neither displayed conventional reactions when confronted with evidence of suffering they had caused. Instead, they exhibited what Whitman described as intellectual curiosity, asking detailed questions about how certain evidence had been discovered or how witnesses had described particular events. This detachment suggested not an absence of emotion, but rather a fundamentally different emotional framework in which human suffering held no special significance. In 1967, during the construction of a Forest Service road approximately 5 miles from the presumed location of the wayside, workers discovered a small leather satchel sealed within a metal box buried beneath a distinctive rock formation. The satchel contained what appears to be Edmund Blackwood's personal journal, covering the period from 1870 to 1888. The journal is now held in the special collections of the West Virginia State Archives, though access is restricted due to the disturbing nature of its contents. Selected excerpts from this journal, published in a 1968 historical quarterly with names redacted, provide unsettling insights into the Blackwoods' philosophy. One passage reads, "The mountains understand necessity in ways that civilized men have forgotten. They do not judge the wolf for consuming the deer, nor the winter for claiming the unprepared traveler. Martha and I have simply aligned ourselves with this ancient wisdom. Those who pass through our door have already been selected, not by us, but by forces far older than human conscience." Another entry, dated 1879, suggests a near-religious devotion to the landscape itself. "We walk the ridge today, observing the valley through morning mist. Martha remarked that we have become like the mountains themselves, patient, immovable, receiving what comes to us by natural law. The stream does not question what flows into it. It simply incorporates and continues. So too with us. We are merely a continuation of processes that have always existed in these ancient hills." Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Blackwood case is how effectively they blended into the community despite their extraordinary activities. Neighbors described them as reserved but pleasant, always willing to contribute to community needs, regularly attending services at the Methodist Church in Welch, and participating in local governance discussions. This seamless integration suggests a level of compartmentalization rarely documented in criminal psychology of the period. The sermon text, preserved in a deacon's personal papers, focused on the biblical passage from Ecclesiastes, "For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast." Those who later recalled this sermon described it as strangely compelling, though somewhat cold in its conclusions. A final unsettling footnote to the case emerged in the mid-1960s when researchers examining birth records from Richmond, Virginia, discovered that Edmund and Martha Blackwood had no familial connection before their marriage. Church records from the Welch Methodist congregation indicate that Edmund occasionally led prayer meetings and once delivered a sermon when the regular minister was ill. In fact, Martha Blackwood appears to have been born Martha Shelton in Philadelphia, while Edmund's origins remain unverified. The discovery raises the troubling possibility that their shared pathology developed independently and found recognition in each other, a chance convergence of complementary darkness rather than a corruption of initially normal human bonds. More disturbing still is the possibility that the Blackwoods were not unique. The isolated nature of Appalachian communities in the late 19th century, combined with the transient population of travelers passing through the region during the post-war period of economic migration, created conditions where similar operations might have existed undetected. Historian Margaret Leach, in her 1972 study of crime patterns in post-Civil War Appalachia, identified 3 other locations along major mountain travel routes where disappearances occurred at statistically improbable rates between 1865 and 1900. None of these locations were ever formally investigated. Occasional reports of unusual sounds emanating from the sealed cave system near the former location of the wayside persist to this day. Geological surveys attribute these phenomena to natural processes, the movement of underground water, the settling of rock formations, or the echo of distant thunder through limestone caverns. Those familiar with the history, however, sometimes describe these sounds differently, as the mountains continuing to digest what the Blackwoods fed them all those years ago. Folklorist William Carpenter, who conducted field recordings throughout Appalachia during the 1950s, collected several local legends that had developed around the wayside. One recurring theme in these stories involves travelers who claim to have been guided away from a certain mountain path by apparitions described as hollow-eyed men in city clothes. Another common element is the sound of distant voices emerging from rock crevices, voices that reportedly call out names and specific amounts of money. Carpenter noted that these folkloric elements had largely replaced the historical facts of the case in local memory, transforming a human atrocity into a supernatural cautionary tale. Today, the approximate location of the wayside is part of the Monongahela National Forest. Hiking trails crisscross the region, and modern travelers pass within yards of where the Blackwoods once offered their deadly hospitality, entirely unaware of what transpired there. Perhaps this is fitting, that a place once defined by deception should itself become invisible, remembered only through documents and stories that grow less distinct with each passing year. And yet, something of the wayside persists in local consciousness. Residents of McDowell County still occasionally use a particular phrase when warning against too readily accepting offered assistance. Not all welcomes lead to exits. The origin of this saying is rarely explained to outsiders, having evolved into a regional colloquialism whose dark genesis has been largely forgotten. In 1998, an archaeological survey conducted as part of an environmental impact assessment for proposed mining operations briefly examined the suspected area of the wayside. Ground-penetrating radar identified subsurface anomalies consistent with the collapsed cellar system described in historical records. Due to the site's historical significance, the area was designated for preservation, and mining plans were adjusted to avoid disturbing it. The survey team reported an unusual experience during their work. Despite being conducted in summer, team members described persistent cold spots where temperatures dropped noticeably without apparent cause. The lead archaeologist's field notes mention another curious discovery: fragments of a porcelain teacup unearthed near what would have been the front entrance of the house. The cup, of a pattern popular in the 1870s, contained trace residues that, when later analyzed, were found to contain compounds derived from Datura stramonium, the same plant Martha Blackwood had cultivated in her herb garden. This physical evidence corroborates Hargrove's testimony regarding the method by which guests were rendered unconscious. For those who study the darkest chapters of Appalachian history, however, the story of the wayside serves as a reminder that true horror rarely announces itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious malevolence. Instead, it often wears the mask of ordinary hospitality: a warm hearth on a cold night, a meal offered without apparent agenda, and a door that opens easily but may close behind you forever. As for Thomas Hargrove, the only known survivor of the Blackwoods' hospitality, his final years were spent in the state hospital in Weston. His medical records indicate that he never fully recovered from his ordeal, experiencing periods of apparent lucidity interrupted by episodes of extreme distress, during which he would attempt to dismantle the floorboards of his room. He died in 1904, having spent his final 15 years searching for an exit that existed only in his fractured memory. Hospital records contain one final chilling detail about Hargrove's condition. In his last years, he developed an unusual behavior. He would meticulously collect and store any food he received, hiding portions throughout his room. When asked about this compulsion, he reportedly gave the same answer each time: "They stop bringing it eventually. Best to prepare while you can." This behavior continued until his death, suggesting that even after 15 years of safety, some part of him remained trapped in that underground chamber, anticipating the Blackwood's final act of abandonment. The most profound question raised by the case remains unanswered after more than a century. How many others passed through the wayside whose disappearances went entirely unnoticed? The Blackwoods' recovered guest ledger contains 173 names recorded between 1872 and 1889. Of these, only 17 were positively linked to reported missing persons. The true extent of their activities may never be known, lost to the same mountain passages that concealed their victims. What we do know comes primarily from financial records uncovered during the investigation. Bank transactions across 5 states show patterns of activity connected to at least 37 individuals who stayed at the wayside. These transactions, account closures, property transfers, unexpected withdrawals, occurred weeks or months after the individuals would have been at the Blackwood property, suggesting that the couple's operation was significantly more extensive than the confirmed cases indicate. Handwriting experts engaged by the Pinkerton Agency examined these financial documents and concluded that nearly all had been forged by the same hand, likely Edmunds, given his merchant background. The forgeries themselves reveal a methodical learning process. Earlier examples show noticeable discrepancies from the authentic signatures they attempted to replicate, while later forgeries demonstrate remarkable precision, detectable only through microscopic analysis of pen pressure and stroke sequence. In 1927, during renovations to the Bank of Welch building, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the floor beneath what had once been a private consultation room. This space contained several items believed to have belonged to the Blackwoods' victims: pocket watches, cufflinks, wedding bands, and personal correspondence. Most significantly, it held what appeared to be Edmunds' forgery practice sheets, pages where he had repeatedly copied signatures from various documents, perfecting his technique with obsessive precision. The question of accomplices has occasionally surfaced in historical analyses of the case. While no evidence directly implicates others in the Blackwoods' primary activities, certain financial transactions would have been difficult to execute without some form of cooperation from banking officials. Records indicate that Edmund maintained regular correspondence with a clerk at the Merchants Bank of Baltimore, correspondence that ceased abruptly following the Blackwoods' arrest. This individual, whose name appears only as H.W. Quantis in recovered documents, relocated to Colorado shortly thereafter and was never formally investigated. Speculation regarding potential accomplices extends beyond financial matters to the practicalities of the Blackwoods' operation. The construction of the elaborate cellar system would have required substantial expertise, knowledge of structural engineering beyond what a former merchant might typically possess. Some historians have suggested that the initial phase of construction, when local men assisted with excavation, might have included someone with specialized knowledge who was later silenced. County death records show that 2 men who participated in the early excavation died under seemingly accidental circumstances within a year of the work's completion. The Blackwoods' method of selecting victims reveals a sophistication that further distinguishes their case from more impulsive criminals of the era. Recovered documents suggest that they maintained correspondence with contacts in larger cities, receiving advance notice of travelers planning journeys through the region. One partial letter, preserved in the case file, reads, "Your location being convenient to the Charleston route, you might extend hospitality to Mr. G., who departs Cincinnati on the 17th. His commercial ventures have recently yielded substantial returns, which he carries in negotiable form. His family situation remains as previously discussed, no immediate concerns regarding inquiries." This network of information would have allowed the Blackwoods to prepare specifically for travelers who met their criteria, while maintaining the appearance of a generally welcoming establishment that served all who arrived. The selective nature of their predation explains how they operated for nearly 2 decades without arousing significant suspicion. The majority of guests did indeed receive the exceptional hospitality for which the Wayside was known, departing to spread positive accounts that attracted future victims. The question of how the Blackwoods initially conceived their operation remains largely unanswered. Edmund's journal contains no origin story explaining the transition from conventional innkeepers to systematic predators. The earliest entries already reference selections and processing, suggesting that the fundamental methodology was established before he began keeping written records. One theory, proposed by criminologist James Thornton in his 1985 analysis of the case, suggests that the Blackwoods may have started opportunistically, perhaps disposing of a troublesome guest who threatened them before recognizing the potential for a more methodical approach. Martha Blackwood's role in the operation appears to have been equally significant to Edmund's, though differently focused. While he managed the financial aspects and what might be called the processing of victims in the cellar chambers, Martha's domain was the initial stage, the selection and incapacitation of targets. Her diary reveals a calculating approach to hospitality, viewing each meal as a carefully orchestrated performance designed to both evaluate and disarm potential victims. One entry, dated July 1883, demonstrates this methodology. The timber merchant took his tea with 2 sugars and spoke at length about his holdings in Pennsylvania. His associates expect him in Charleston no sooner than the 27th, giving us ample time for the necessary conversations. The laudanum dose must be increased for a man of his size. Last month's difficulties with the railroad inspector demonstrated the importance of proper calibration. The diary also suggests that Martha took particular satisfaction in the psychological aspects of their activities. She describes in detail the conversations held with imprisoned guests, noting their progression from confusion to bargaining to despair. Her entries display no conventional emotional response to suffering. Instead, they contain detailed observations about behavioral patterns and psychological breaking points, recorded with clinical detachment. Dr. Whitman's psychological assessment conducted before the trial specifically addresses this aspect of Martha's personality. Female perpetrators of violence typically display emotional justifications for their actions, jealousy, fear, or revenge being common motivators. Mrs. Blackwood demonstrates none of these. She speaks of her victims as one might discuss specimens in a scientific experiment, noting reactions and outcomes without apparent empathy or animus. This absence of emotional involvement while maintaining high intellectual function represents a psychological profile so rare as to be virtually undocumented in the existing literature. The cellar complex itself has been the subject of subsequent architectural analysis. From measurements and descriptions recorded during the investigation, modern engineers have concluded that its design showed sophisticated understanding of structural principles. The timber supports were arranged to distribute weight optimally, while the angled ventilation shafts provided minimal air exchange while remaining virtually undetectable from the surface. The acoustic properties, specifically the sound-dampening materials used in wall construction, suggest knowledge of principles that were not commonly understood outside specialized fields in the late 19th century. This technical sophistication has led some researchers to question Edmund's stated background as a merchant. Architectural historian Eleanor Winters, in a 2005 paper on vernacular construction techniques in Appalachia, suggests that he may have had experience in mining or military engineering, fields that would have provided the necessary knowledge for such an elaborate underground structure. No records confirming such experience have been discovered, adding another layer to the mystery of the Blackwoods' origins. The impact of the Blackwood case extended beyond the immediate investigation and trial. It sparked one of the first systematic efforts to track missing persons across state lines, as authorities realized that the victims had come from multiple states and that no centralized mechanism existed for correlating such disappearances. The Pinkerton Agency subsequently established a dedicated department for cross-referencing missing persons reports from different jurisdictions, an innovation that would later influence the development of federal investigative practices. The case also had lasting effects on hospitality practices throughout the region. Many establishments began keeping more detailed records of both arrivals and departures, often requiring guests to indicate their next destination and expected arrival date. Some larger hotels implemented a primitive form of traveler verification, requesting letters of introduction or business references, particularly from those journeying alone. These practices eventually faded as more formalized hospitality systems emerged in the early 20th century, but they represent a direct response to the fear generated by the Blackwood case. In cultural terms, the case entered regional folklore almost immediately, though often in forms that obscured its actual nature. By the early 1900s, parents throughout Appalachia were warning children not to accept hospitality from strangers, with variations of the phrase, "Remember the wayside." As the specific details faded from common knowledge, this evolved into more generalized cautionary tales about the dangers awaiting travelers who strayed from established routes or accepted assistance too readily. A collection of mountain ballads compiled in 1935 by folklorist Alan Lomax includes a song titled "The Hollow Hills Inn," which clearly references the Blackwood case while transforming it into a supernatural narrative. The lyrics describe a house where the guests check in with smiles so bright, but never check out in the morning light, and where the cellar doors lead straight to hell, with a host and hostess kind as well. This transformation of historical atrocity into folklore parallels similar processes documented with other notorious crimes, revealing how communities process traumatic events through cultural narratives. Academic interest in the case has ebbed and flowed over the decades. The first scholarly analysis appeared in 1922, when criminologist Herbert Asbury included a chapter on the Blackwoods in his survey of notable American crimes. Interest resurged in the 1960s, coinciding with the discovery of Edmunds' Journal, and again in the 1990s when the case featured prominently in early literature on serial predators and paired criminal behavior. Recent analysis has focused particularly on the Blackwoods as an early example of a criminal partnership in which both parties appear to have been equally invested in and essential to the criminal enterprise. Unlike many criminal couples where one partner is clearly dominant, the evidence suggests that Edmund and Martha operated as true collaborators, each handling aspects of their operation that suited their particular skills and temperaments. The geographical isolation that facilitated the Blackwoods' activities represents a recurring theme in criminal history. The Appalachian region, with its challenging terrain and scattered population, created conditions where travelers were necessarily vulnerable, dependent on the goodwill of those offering shelter and assistance. This vulnerability has historical parallels in other frontier or remote settings, from the isolated steppes of Russia to the vast distances of the Australian outback, where similar cases of predatory hospitality have been documented. What distinguishes the Blackwood case even among these parallels is the sophisticated infrastructure they developed. The cellar complex represents a level of investment and planning rarely seen in criminal enterprises of the era. Most predators who targeted travelers operated opportunistically, adapting existing structures or natural features for their purposes. The Blackwoods, by contrast, created a purpose-built facility designed specifically for extended captivity and methodical exploitation, a forerunner of the specialized crime scenes that would become more common in the 20th century. The ultimate fate of the site itself reflects changing attitudes towards such locations. In the immediate aftermath of the case, there were calls to obliterate all traces of the wayside, with some local religious leaders suggesting that the land itself had been corrupted by the Blackwoods' activities. The county's decision to burn the structures while sealing, rather than destroying the cellar complex, represented a compromise between historical preservation and the desire to prevent the location from becoming a macabre attraction. By the mid-20th century, as the case passed from living memory into historical record, preservation concerns began to outweigh discomfort. The 1988 archaeological survey that identified the remaining subsurface features led to the area's designation as a historically significant site, protected from development or disturbance. No markers identify its significance to casual visitors, a deliberate decision by Forest Service administrators to prevent vandalism and inappropriate tourism, but its coordinates are recorded in historical registries, ensuring that this physical evidence of the Blackwoods crimes remains preserved for future research. Today, the approximate location of the wayside is part of the Monongahela National Forest. Hiking trails crisscross the region, and modern travelers pass within yards of where the Blackwoods once offered their deadly hospitality, entirely unaware of what transpired there. Perhaps this is fitting, that a place once defined by deception should itself become invisible, remembered only through documents and stories that grow less distinct with each passing year. And yet, something of the wayside persists in local consciousness. Residents of McDowell County still occasionally use a particular phrase when warning against too readily accepting offered assistance. Not all welcomes lead to exits. The origin of this saying is rarely explained to outsiders, having evolved into a regional colloquialism whose dark genesis has been largely forgotten. For those who study the darkest chapters of Appalachian history, however, the story of the wayside serves as a reminder that true horror rarely announces itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious malevolence. Instead, it often wears the mask of ordinary hospitality, a warm hearth on a cold night, a meal offered without apparent agenda, and a door that opens easily but may close behind you forever. As for Thomas Hargrove, the only known survivor of the Blackwoods hospitality, his final years were spent in the state hospital in Weston. His medical records indicate that he never fully recovered from his ordeal, experiencing periods of apparent lucidity interrupted by episodes of extreme distress during which he would attempt to dismantle the floorboards of his room. He died in 1904, having spent his final 15 years searching for an exit that existed only in his fractured memory. The most profound question raised by the case remains unanswered after more than a century. How many others passed through the wayside whose disappearances went entirely unnoticed? The Blackwoods recovered guest ledger contains 173 names recorded between 1872 and 1889. Of these, only 17 were positively linked to reported missing persons. The true extent of their activities may never be known, lost to the same mountain passages that concealed their victims. As you travel through the winding roads of Appalachia, consider how many similar stories remain buried beneath the region's breathtaking beauty, histories not preserved in official records or academic texts, but in the collective memory of communities that have learned through centuries of isolation and self-reliance that some knowledge is better transmitted through whispered warnings than written accounts. And should you find yourself seeking shelter in these mountains as daylight fades, remember that hospitality, like all human gestures, contains within it both the capacity for profound kindness and the potential for unfathomable betrayal. The threshold between these possibilities is often invisible until crossed, and by then it may be too late to turn back. In the words carved into a tree near the former site of the wayside, discovered during a 1975 forest survey and attributed to an unknown hand, they welcomed all who passed this way with warmth that hid a colder aim. The hills remember what they took, though names and faces fade with time. The hills of Appalachia keep their secrets well. The story of the Blackwoods is just one that has managed to emerge from the mist of history. A warning that in remote places where necessity makes strangers interdependent, the hand that offers help may not always lead you back to the light.